Well, in the last module, we talked a lot about the kinds of physical changes that the human body underwent in its way to becoming a modern human. And so we focused on two things, bipedalism and the evolution of a really big head. And today what we're going to look at and discuss is how those changes in the physical body of humans subsequently begat reciprocal changes in the nature of human society, how humans lived and interacted with each other. So we'll talk first about how those big heads have consequences that include many aspects of how society was woven together. Then we'll talk about these specific changes in the structure of human society that led to where we are today. And lastly, some of the broader changes that were undertaken because of these changes both in our physical structure and in our societal structure. So when we last left our hunter-gatherer friends, they were driven from their arboreal residence in the trees to the ground because we think that there was a lengthy extended period of drought in Africa, which dried up the fruits in the trees and meant that in order to survive, mankind had to leave the trees and eke out a living, often a subsistence living, on the ground. And that after this took place, or as this took place, as humans progressively left the trees and underwent the physical changes that we talked about last time, there were enormous consequences as a result of those changes having been executed for the way humans structured their society. And that is the focus of today's presentation. So, the consequences of having those really big heads were pivotal in the formation of modern human societies. We've already talked about this at length. You know that human heads cannot be fully formed at birth. You know also that the human head continues to grow and develop for roughly 18 years. And that preceding the ultimate launch of a functional human, an extended period of immaturity is the norm. And this picture down here illustrates why this is the case rather vividly. This is a human skull. You're looking down on the top of the skull, roughly at the point of birth, and what you see is this enormous, unprotected part of the skull. You see the normal skull bones here, and here, and here, and here. But what I've circled here is the place where these skull bones have not yet covered the brain. And that is a huge point of vulnerability. If you've had younger siblings or you've had your own child yourself, you know that there's this thing called the soft spot on the top of an infant's head, which you're instructed never to touch because there's no protective skull in that spot, and it's a point at which the brain is enormously vulnerable until the skull fuses and covers that part as well. In fact, if you look at a very young infant, you can actually see the blood vessels and the blood beating underneath because it has no bony protective covering at that point. So this is one of the reasons why we say that humans are born in a very immature state. Not only are the bones not yet fused, but the underlying brain is in a state of great immaturity as well, and it has to undergo huge developmental changes to lead to a functioning human brain the way we understand it. So during this period, we have an absolute need for parents or parental figures to protect and also to teach, because as we've also discussed, there's a huge social component to producing a functioning human, and these social identities don't come about just by your genes. You have to be taught. And for all of these reasons, we have this ongoing need to have some sort of intact social structure, usually revolving around a family, the cornerstone of which we've already argued is having a high degree of hope in and among that social unit to keep the family intact long enough to bring this child to maturity where he is independent. Again, I defer to Lionel Tiger, who said, you've seen this quote before, quote, "Children require a long period of close emotional relationship with protective adult figures in order to function effectively as adults themselves. If they do not have such relationships, whatever technical skills they may acquire, their performance in life will be inhibited or distorted by basic social incompetence." So part of the repertoire of skills that we need as humans in order to properly negotiate the world, which includes interacting with other humans, requires a well-honed social repertoire of skills in addition to the basic functional skills like dressing, feeding, and defending oneself. So let's talk about the basic process of rearing a child to the point of independence. You know that infants are completely helpless. They cannot feed themselves if they don't have an adult figure to do so with them. So once we pass out of the infant stage, let's say at roughly a year, maybe a little longer, we enter the toddler stage. And even though toddlers can walk and they might be able to feed themselves in a rudimentary way, in a sense, they are more dependent than even infants, because toddlers have the ability to get around and get into things, but they have absolutely no common sense, none. And so they do things that are inherently dangerous to themselves without realizing that it's dangerous. And so toddlers are a special problem because although they're cute and they're ambulatory, they get around, they can talk a little bit, they're very cute, but they have absolutely no understanding of how the world works and what's dangerous and what's not. Leaving toddlerhood, we enter the realm of young children, somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 10 years old. There's a basic mastery of language at this point. They can communicate. They might be able to follow simple instructions, that sort of thing. And this is the period during which their social intelligence is being developed as well. And so this is also a very critical window of development among children. If they're not properly schooled by the cultural icons around them, they will grow up to be socially incompetent, as Tiger alluded to. Once children get to be teenagers, again, we have a sort of a dichotomy in the way they are. Teenagers are big enough and strong enough, God knows they've got the energy, to pick up some of the workload and begin to contribute. But teenagers also, now experiencing hormones coursing through their blood for the first time, might be, a little bit crazy. And so they require, again, more supervision and help in understanding what's good behavior, because it is life-sustaining. So for the first 3 or 4 years of one's existence, a constant caretaker, whether it's a mother or a father or a grandmother, it doesn't matter all that much, as long as there's somebody filling this role. And this person will be the one to provide food, shelter, the nurturing emotional attachment without which the resulting person will be socially inept, is what's going on during these first several years. Now, in most animals, including humans, it is the mother who plays this very important role. But in animals, this lasts only a couple of weeks or maybe months, and after that point, the young animal is pretty much functional and capable of operating on his or her own. But in humans, our period of dependence lasts much longer, and it's usually the mother who takes the lead and bears most of the responsibility for this period of life. Fathers obviously can do this as well, and in modern society, fathers are increasingly serving this role. There are even animals who opt for this father-based care of the young, specifically including animals such as seahorses. It's the father who takes care of the young seahorses. There are beetles that do the same thing. But in primitive societies and hunter-gatherer societies, the activities and talents of men were needed to do things like feed everybody, to go out there and hunt, and also to defend the tribe against both predators and human interlopers. So there was a basic division of labor along these lines. The women are responsible for gathering activities, for food acquisition, and also for the raising of young, while men were out there in the bushes looking for food and also making sure that the tribe was safe. Now, once we get to young children, let's say after the age of 3 or thereabouts, the goal of the tribe and the effort required by the supervisory personnel would include not only making sure that the child was kept from danger, but also engaging in that intensive teaching that would be required to produce a functional adult. Language acquisition is something that goes on during this period, and interestingly enough, it happens fairly effortlessly on the part of the child. We don't sit infants down and drill them in the ABCs. What we do is talk to them and in front of them, and in that way, they passively learn their mother tongue, so that even very young children can acquire basic language facility at a relatively young age simply by participating in the making of sounds which progress in complexity over time. And that's one reason why it's really important to talk to and read to a young child. That's how they learn language, and they do so, as I said, pretty effortlessly. They're also learning the rules of society. Some of these are rules that are designed to keep one safe, but others govern the nature of interactions between the child and other humans. And so this is a really important part of one's education, because if you can't learn these rules, if you will not learn these rules, then you're always going to be at odds with the society of which you're a part, and that can lead to a lack of social cohesion, which can be quite corrosive, particularly in subsistence societies that require a high amount of cooperation between individuals. Children at this age also learn the collective beliefs of the family group or the tribe, and those get inculcated and reinforced as the child moves through the rest of his or her childhood. So we might ask, well, who does all of this important work, all of this teaching? Recall that the men are out there hunting and defending, and the women are busy having babies and maybe doing some gathering activities. So it doesn't leave a lot of time for this really important stuff that the kids have to learn. And if the parents can't do it, then somebody else has to pick up the slack. We've already talked about how that might happen, and we'll do so again in a minute. Now, neurobiologically speaking, the unfinished brains of babies and children are incredibly active during this period. We referenced a quote from Tiger again, talking about how there's a reciprocal need of the child to undergo massive amounts of learning during this period, as well as a reciprocal desire on behalf of the parent and other adults to furnish the experiences and the learning that the child must have in order to be functional. So what we know neurobiologically is that as these processes are unfolding and being rooted in the children, what they're doing neurobiologically is forming new connections, new dendrites primarily, between the neurons in the brain and elsewhere. We know that there are critical phases to this development, and if it doesn't happen during this phase, then either the learning becomes much more difficult or it may not be possible to learn it at all. In other words, if the neuronal connections, primarily the formation of new connections or new dendrites between the existing neurons, if they're not formed during the correct developmental time frame, they may never form, and that adult will be socially inept or incompetent in other ways that might be really important to his or her ultimate survival. So this critical period, and there are different critical periods for different phenomena, these windows are really important to meet. In other words, we have to have the neuronal connections being formed during these critical periods. If they're not, that person may not have a good future in the tribe. And one way to reference this is to think about language acquisition. If you learn your mother tongue, as most of you do, in early childhood, you will be a fluent speaker by the age of 4 or 5. And as I said, this is a really complicated skill that's acquired basically without effort on your part. If, however, you miss that window, let's say you are abandoned at birth and raised by wolves, if you don't get the information about language, if you don't practice it every day, and you have to pick it up later, let's say as a teenager, you will find it very difficult to acquire your mother tongue, which you would otherwise get as a present from your social interactions with others at an early toddlerhood, early childhood stage. And so it's always much more difficult to learn a new language after this critical period has elapsed, and it's not to say that it can't be done, but it's much harder, and you'll have some sort of accent, or you won't have the accent of the people with whom you are now in residence, because it's very difficult to hear those nuances and to apply them. So there are these critical windows. If they're not met, it's a problem. So why do we belabor all of these points? Well, the changes in the physical body that we've already discussed ultimately had an interesting impact on the nature of society itself that revolved around the reality of having to raise completely dependent children for long periods of time. One of those initial changes, we intuit, was that while the males of all primates guard females to some extent, and usually it's pretty minimal in species like orangs and chimps and so forth. And the intention there is to ward off other males who might mate with a given female. It looks as if in early humans, who are now, of course, living on the ground and had the structural changes that included a big brain and bipedalism, when this happened, or after this happened, mate guarding likely intensified, initially due to the potential for increased chances of being eaten by a large predator when you're on the ground. Being in the canopy of trees offered some protection against ground-based predators, but that was erased once people descended to the ground and took up life on the ground. So males now on the ground had incentives to guard and defend females, from which there were additional consequences. So let's say that initially a given male would probably have guarded as many females as he possibly could so that he would have access to mating with all of them. But as the dynamics of the situation changed, now there was a bigger concern of predators and also human interlopers. It's likely that a given male could guard a smaller and smaller group of females. Now, because of the intense dependence of human children in the early years, it would have been helpful as well if males would participate in some of the care of those children. So over time, it looks as if the usual primate modality, which is for a male to pursue and mate with as many females as he could, changed to one in which there was selective pressure to narrow the pursuit of females and set up shop with one female, which would then help focus his attention on some of the domestic chores, like not necessarily feeding the children, but perhaps tending his mate during the time that she was tied up with the care of infants, for instance. So with two people involved in the child care, it would be possible to leave more offspring, which in a subsistence society is a very critical thing. And as humans and their brains got bigger and children were born in a more immature state, it would be necessary for those males to guard fewer and fewer females until monogamy, as we know it, became the normal and the desired state. And there would be additional consequences of that conversion, perhaps unwilling consequences, but nonetheless things that happened as a result once monogamy took root among humans. So think about it. Initially, in order to have access to females, having great physical strength was a requirement. That way you could ward off other males and defend a large number of females from those males. But as the brain got bigger and our capacity to make tools and wield tools became established, it would be possible for a non-imposing, less physically threatening male to now have access to at least one female. Now, initially, it's likely that these weapons were used both to hunt and acquire food and also to defend from other tribes. But as time went on, the brain got bigger, the social manipulations that were possible increased. It's likely that those males were using weapons to guard a given female within a tribe from other tribal members. And then this would help solidify monogamy because even smaller men could use weapons to defend a mate, and they too could themselves pass on their genes in a lineage. And this likely gave rise to the long-term pair bond. We've already talked about this in the work of Helen Fisher. You know that there's an underlying biochemical basis, that the neurohormonal basis changes over time, but it is certainly demonstrable that love as we know it has a biochemical basis, and the feelings that arise during a relationship, which we call love, are important in keeping people together. But also, let's acknowledge that this is a Faustian bargain in which both the male and the female partner give something up to serve a greater good. The male partner gives up the pursuit of other females, at least on paper. We know there's a lot of cheating. And the female partner gives up the trading up syndrome, in which a female, let's say she's mated to, has a pair bond with a guy named Jim, and yet a guy named Joe gets a better pickup truck, so she's thinking to herself, Joe looks like a better provider. I think I'll go with him. And she gives up Jim, goes with Joe. And this is, of course, the whole basis for country western songs. So this attitude is alive and well. But my point is that both the male and the female partner give up something in a monogamous relationship. But the stability of the family unit and the proper rearing of children to the stage of independence absolutely relies on the curbing of one's self-interest, in this case, meaning the pursuit of other sexual partners, so that the likelihood a child will make it to adulthood is increased. I would also argue that hope undergirds the sacrifice that both sexes are making on behalf of the child, which is itself the ultimate act of hope. Another consequence of monogamy is that humans needed a reliable and predictable way to recognize each other, particularly as tribes grew. They needed to be able to tell relatively rapidly and without getting too close that one belonged to one's own tribal group. And of course, there would be an absolute need for mates to tell other mates from each other, and for there to be a way for others to identify one's mate as belonging not to them, but to somebody else. So animals use smell for this purpose primarily, but obviously if the major predator of humans is other humans, you don't want to have to get close enough to smell somebody in order to determine that they are a member of one's tribal group or that they are in fact one's mate. So how do we do this? Well, humankind has developed an amazing cornucopia of ritualistic behavior that might be something as minimal as a handshake. All societies have a handshake. They vary in how they're conducted, or maybe a tribal dance or some sort of ritualistic behavior that identifies one as belonging to that special group, which you call your own. Only tribal members will know this behavior, and therefore we can use it as kind of as a shibboleth, as a way of identifying foreigners from natives. So this ideally would allow tribal members to identify each other from a distance, and this begins then to solidify the identity of the tribal group as the others sharing in these ritualistic behaviors that impart that group identity. We also know that during this period, humans developed body art, which they practiced liberally. And we suspect that one of the functions of body art, in addition to being an expression of beauty and creativity, is simply to identify one's kinsmen so we know who belongs to which tribe. So this could be established by tattoos, by body art, by other elements that adorn the body that identify one specifically as a member of a particular group. But this begets the question, okay, well, this is all complicated stuff. So who's going to be responsible for teaching this? The body art is one thing that requires a fair amount of education in order to conduct properly, but also the behavioral rituals, the songs, the dances, the ways of interpreting nature, all of these things are shared customs and rituals which have to be taught to children by someone. Who is that someone? Well, we talked about this earlier. Remember that the mothers were tied up doing reproductive things. The fathers were busy doing hunting and fending off predators, including other humans. So it looks as if, at least according to Catherine Coe, that grandmothers were the solution to this problem. She cast this as her ancestress hypothesis, the idea that most species cast off non-reproductive females or senescent females as not pulling their weight biologically, but imposing a cost on the society. And so most species say, you know what, you're done. Grandmothers, you're out of here. But humans, there are exceptions, but humans normally don't do this. And it may be because we needed them back in the days of the hunter-gatherers to help educate and take care of the little kids, to inculcate those social mores and social cues without which one is socially incompetent and will not have an optimally productive adulthood. So inculcation of tribal customs, including The kinds of art that we use to adorn our body or simply express our creative bent, those may have been farmed out to the grandmothers who stayed home with the young children and did all of this really important stuff so that we could have functional societies that ultimately led to our own. Now you can ask, do we have functional societies today? That's another question. Now, here's another ripple of the need to identify one's clan members. If we have genetically related males living within a tribal group, that would further change the nature of that group and the social behavior that underwrote it. We know that great ape societies in general, chimp societies particularly, we've studied them a lot, they're highly promiscuous. And as a consequence of that promiscuity, a particular individual only knows that he is related to his mother who nursed him and his siblings who came from the same mother. But in a monogamous society, if everybody's playing by the rules, a male is reasonably confident that his daughters are his own children and that they are, in fact, his genetic lineage. And here's the consequence. When those daughters are married off to somebody else in another group, presumably another group of the same tribe, but one without a direct genetic connection, when that happens, the male will now recognize the daughter's husband as an extension of his own family. So this initially simply provided a mechanism to grow the society by melding together these different extensions of a particular tribe through having mutual common interests based on social cohesion. And that social cohesion came about because it used to be that neighboring groups would be considered hostile and that males from those groups would be killed on sight, particularly if they had no genetic relationship to one's tribe. But now, with the confidence that a given male has that his daughter is his own child, and if she's married off to another group within the tribe, now the male has a reason not to kill foreign males on sight, because that might be one of his in-laws, and they have a shared interest in promoting the welfare of their children joined in marriage, because that is how one's genetic lineage is perpetuated. So the tribes could become bound to one another through the exchange of women, which is something that we have practiced now for millennia. And this basically pushed human aggression to the tribal level. We know that chimps will fight neighboring bands on sight. But among humans, as long as there is some sort of genetic relationship between band members and the members in question have the proper recognition cues so that we know friend from foe, this would have pushed warfare to the tribal level. If you belong to a foreign tribe, you would still get attacked. But if you belonged to a local group, not your particular local group, but one that was at least part of your extended tribe, it would not automatically engender a hostile, violent response if you invaded the territory of the local tribe. So this meant that cooperation within each extended tribal group became the rule, cooperation, rather than immediate and violent responses. Now we know that tribalism is alive today. We have evidence of tribalistic behavior all around us. And by tribalism, what do we mean? Well, we mean sort of a thing, an identifiable interest that binds us together and that causes us to look at those who do not share that identity as ridiculous, as stupid, as anathema, as the source of derision. And we have abundant examples of this phenomenon, whether we're talking about religion or sports or politics or genocide. We identify with our own tribal group and we eschew and often hate those who have another point of view. And this is kind of understandable because tribalistic behavior has been a long-standing component of the human behavioral repertoire. But importantly, early on in our experience as humans on this planet, we moved from reflexive fighting to at least some level of cooperation if there were a genetic link of some sort between a native group and a competing group. And to understand this, we need to recall again and again that hunter-gatherers lived on the edge of extinction. It's likely that human beings as a species came close to actual extinction on a number of occasions because hunter-gatherers were trying to eke out a subsistence living. That's what drove them down from the trees. That's what caused them to spread around the globe in search of a better food supply. And this had a lot of consequences. The reason that we were moving around was to look for better and more food. But we also realized, and there was selective pressure to this end, that if humans cooperated with each other in the execution of those things that needed to be done in order to secure the resources necessary to live, then life itself became much simpler. And there were two basic realms in which cooperation really facilitated humans being able to establish a foothold on the planet. The first was that if one faces dangers, whether it's a saber-toothed tiger or other humans, the protection of one's group is much easier if we act collectively in that defense. In addition, the other way in which cooperation was a major step forward in human society is that cooperation in the procurement of food and the subsequent sharing of that food with the entire population allowed us to productively breed a larger human population. And this required that males focus on one female at a time and leave other females alone, thereby increasing the viability of one's own genetic line. So this is a really important point because cooperation is an unusual feature in animal society. But among humans, it was absolutely critical in allowing Homo sapiens to become established on the planet. And let's just think about this as if we were hunter-gatherers. We know that as time went on, our brains got bigger, our hands were freed up for new purposes by not hanging out in the trees where we needed our hands to brachiate and that sort of thing. So as a consequence of these changes, humans became very proficient tool makers. And while it might be the case, and we see this behavior in evidence today, that if one came up with a really cool design for the shaft of a knife, let's say, and kept it to himself, then you'd always be the special guy who could make the really good knives, and that might be a way to solidify your status in society. And yet, everybody prospered if the inventor of that technology shared it with everybody else so that all people could make knives and use those knives to support the group. So, if this happened, the way I'm suggesting, then the sharing of those techniques and how you make those new technologies work would have been a huge asset. The people in that group would have been able to hunt bigger and bigger game A single man hunting by himself could bag a rabbit, but if you have a whole bunch of men hunting together with the best available technology, then much larger prey, like a wildebeest or a woolly mammoth, could have been killed, and that would feed the entire group for a long period of time. So you see why cooperation, which is not the natural state in nature, and the sharing of that information would have been a huge asset for those groups who practiced it. As I mentioned, food was shared routinely among all members of a tribal group. The increase in technology allowed that group to bag larger and larger prey. And at this point, it became helpful to spread the basic work around so that particular humans could focus on those things which were most beneficial to the entire group. So if women were not out there hunting, as was clearly the case, they could concentrate on the child rearing and, to a limited extent, the gathering activities in the locality where they were present. And this over time led to a division of labor where men would go out and hunt and defend the tribe and women would gather food. But the important thing is that irrespective of the source of that food, everybody shared in the food. So you didn't have to be the one who got the food in order to benefit from the fact that everybody got to eat. And this sort of cemented the outline of what we would call an egalitarian society, where all people shared equally. There was no tribal authority, no tribal leader. Everybody was considered on the same equal footing. So, over time, an egalitarian society emerged as the changes that were precipitated by males becoming monogamous continued to play out. So another big change that was also underway during the early hunter-gatherer years was to constantly be on the move in order to find enough food to support the tribe, which, if things were going well, would have been growing. And this led to the inculcation of a nomadic lifestyle among the hunter-gatherers in their egalitarian society. When one food source dried up, they could simply move on. And this led to demonstrated nomadism in the human species in those early hunter-gatherer years. Rather than trying to put down roots, build a solid structure we'd call a house, they simply became nomadic, and they moved around the globe in a very big way. And I want to emphasize that cooperation was absolutely critical to the nomadic lifestyle. When resources dried up, they just moved on. But in order to do that, they would have to send somebody out as a scout. You don't want to move a whole group to a place where there's no new resources. So somebody would have had to have gone ahead with the proper skills needed to navigate a new terrain and report back what was there. When they decided on a direction in which they wanted to move, because it looked like there were better resources, then the entire group would have to cooperate in the moving of their limited assets. You had to pack all this stuff up. You had to physically move it to the new location. You had to figure out a way to get the infant children in a way that would protect them and get them safely to the new place. And once they got to the new environment, there may be significant changes and adaptations that would be required to be successful in getting more food out of that landscape. So cooperation among the individuals doing this traveling to new places would have been absolutely imperative to being successful in those new environments and during the time of transition when they were moving to the new place. But the fact that they were successful is irrefutable. Here we see a lovely graphic. Down here, we have a scale provided in thousands of years before present. And what we see is that if you look at the geographical code, which is in the upper picture here, and you decode it, you see that Africa, where humankind was born, is in this sort of reddish-brown color. And you can see down on the time scale here that the reddish-brown color is what we started with. But over time, as humans began to move both within Africa and out of Africa, different colors appear as humans entered Europe, followed by Asia, and then really far-flung places like the Americas. And they did this, as far as we can tell, in less than 50,000 years. So think about what that requires. You don't know where you're going. You don't have a map. You also don't have much in the way of transportation. But in order to get to places like the Americas, there was a land bridge in what was previously known as the Bering Strait. So that would be simply an overland route. But they also went to places like Australia and New Zealand, which would require some way to get from place to place in a boat. So the fact that we as a species migrated entirely around the world, we didn't get to Antarctica, okay, but who wants to go there? In less than probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 50,000 years is quite astonishing. So we were a tour de force, as they say. So if we kind of pull this all together and summarize it, once humans left the trees, there were many physical changes to the human body, which we've discussed in some detail. And these physical changes to the human body begat other changes that impacted the nature of society. There was a communal focus on raising those helpless children. There was an important change when males began to guard and mate with individual females, giving up a polygamous lifestyle for one that was monogamous. Monogamy then led to a stronger pair bond to keep those parents together for the time needed to raise those children. As I mentioned, there was also an incentive to not immediately kill males from another tribal group upon sight because of commerce in young women as basically bargaining chips between semi-related tribes, not to kill each other. With marriage between those local bands, it became incentivized not to kill other males upon sight because they could be a potential relative and one they had a shared genetic lineage. So males then had an incentive to refrain from attacking males to whom they had a shared genetic relationship, which permitted the formation of larger societies, if nothing else, by coalescing two local bands together to form a bigger group. During this time, and certainly as this played out, selective pressure for cooperation, particularly in things like hunting and gathering and defense, resulted from increased capacity to make tools, share that technology cooperatively, and increased resource acquisition definitely allowed for bigger groups of humans to be supported and to continue to grow the number of individuals in the tribe, thus expanding the human population. Likewise, nomadism was solidified as a way of life simply because we hadn't yet mastered the idea of growing crops, nor yet produced the tools necessary to that end. So it was easier simply to pick everything up and move around the globe, which we did with a fair amount of efficiency, as I've already discussed. And here is your study guide for this module.